He didn't just cheat on me. He replaced me like I never existed. And in that moment, standing there, watching everything I thought was real collapse in front of me, I believed my life was over. But what I didn't know was that the worst night of my life was actually the moment everything started changing. Because 3 days later, I met someone who didn't just see me differently. He saw me the way I was supposed to be seen all along. Before we continue, like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I met him at a time when my life felt like it was slowly coming together, not perfectly, but enough to feel like I was moving in the right direction. He didn't enter my life in a dramatic way. There was no instant spark that felt overwhelming, no moment that stood out as something extraordinary. It was simple, natural, the kind of connection that builds quietly without demanding attention. And maybe that's why I trusted it so easily. He had a way of making things feel stable. Conversations didn't feel forced, and time spent together never felt like something that needed effort. He remembered small details, things I mentioned casually that most people would forget. He showed up when he said he would, checked in without being asked, created a rhythm that felt dependable. And over time, those small consistencies built something bigger. Something that felt real. I let him into parts of my life I didn't share easily. My plans, my fears, the things I was still trying to figure out about myself. And he listened in a way that made me feel understood. Not judged, not questioned, just accepted. That's how trust forms. Not in big promises, but in repeated moments that feel safe enough to believe in. Looking back now, I can see the details I overlooked. The slight delays in his responses that didn't match his explanations. The moments where his attention felt divided, even when he was physically present. The way certain conversations would shift when they got too close to something real. But at the time, those things didn't stand out enough to challenge what I believed we had. Because when something feels right, your mind protects it. It fills in gaps, smooths over inconsistencies, and holds onto the version of reality that feels the most comfortable. And for me, that version included him. The night everything changed didn't start with tension. It started like every other night we had spent together.
Familiar.
Predictable. He asked me to come over, said we needed to talk, but there was nothing in his tone that suggested urgency. If anything, it sounded routine. And that's what made it dangerous. Because nothing prepared me for what I was about to walk into. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was how still everything felt. Not empty, not quiet in a normal way, but slightly off. The door wasn't fully closed, which wasn't like him, but I didn't question it. I stepped inside slowly, calling his name the way I always did, expecting a response that never came. Instead, I heard something else. Laughter. At first, my mind tried to place it somewhere else, to create a version of the situation that made sense. But as I moved further in, that version started to fall apart. The sound became clearer, more distinct. And then I heard his voice. Not distant, not uncertain, comfortable. That's when something inside me shifted. I moved closer, not rushing, not stopping, just trying to understand what I was walking into before I fully saw it. But when I turned the corner, there was nothing left to understand. Everything was already clear. He was there, sitting close to someone else, not hiding, not caught off guard, just present in a way that made it feel like I didn't belong in that space anymore. And the moment he saw me, something changed, not in the way I expected. There was no panic,
No guilt.
just a brief pause, followed by something that felt worse than either of those things. Irritation. Like I had interrupted something that had already been decided. I didn't react the way people expect in moments like that. There was no raised voice, no confrontation, no demand for answers. Because the truth was already there, clear enough that nothing he could say would change it. And in that moment, I understood something that made reacting feel unnecessary. It was over. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that needed confirmation. Just done. So I left. Not quickly, not slowly, just intentionally. Each step away from that space felt heavier than it should have. Not because I didn't know what I was doing, but because I was processing everything at the same time. The reality of what I had seen. The weight of everything it meant. The sudden absence of a future I had already imagined. The silence that followed was different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that forces you to sit with thoughts you're not ready to face. Messages came in. Calls followed. But I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I didn't know how to explain something I hadn't fully understood myself. Days passed in a way that didn't feel connected. Like time was moving, but I wasn't fully present in it. And somewhere in that space, between confusion and acceptance, something started to form. Not healing. Not yet. But awareness. Because once you see someone clearly, you can't return to who you thought they were. 3 days passed before I stepped outside again, and when I finally did, it wasn't because I felt ready. It was because staying inside had started to feel heavier than everything I was trying to avoid. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of him, somewhere that didn't carry memories I wasn't ready to face. I ended up in a quiet place, not crowded, not empty, just calm enough to sit without feeling watched. I chose a seat by the corner, far enough from everyone else, and for a while, I didn't do anything. I just sat there, trying to slow my thoughts down, trying to make sense of something that didn't feel like it made sense yet. The first interaction wasn't intentional. It was small enough to ignore, but noticeable enough to stay. I had ordered something I didn't even really want, more out of habit than interest, and when it arrived, I realized it wasn't what I asked for. Normally, I would have just accepted it, but before I could decide what to do, someone spoke. Not loudly, not interrupting, just enough to get my attention without forcing it. He pointed out the mistake calmly, like it was an observation, not a correction, and for a second, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, but because I wasn't expecting someone to notice something that small. When I finally did respond, it wasn't a full conversation, just a few words. A simple exchange that should have ended there. But it didn't. There was a pause after that, not awkward, not forced, just present. And instead of filling it with unnecessary words, he let it sit. That's what made it different. Most people rush to speak, to avoid silence, to keep something going even when it doesn't need to. But he didn't. He was comfortable with it. And somehow, that made me feel more at ease than any conversation could have. When he spoke again, it wasn't a question that demanded an answer. It was simple. He asked if I was okay, but not in the way people usually do. Not casually. Not out of obligation. There was intention behind it, like he wasn't just asking to be polite, but because he had already noticed something I hadn't said. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Because the truth was I wasn't okay. But I also wasn't ready to explain why. So I gave the kind of answer people give when they don't want to open that door. Short. Controlled. Enough to move past it. He didn't challenge it. Didn't push. Just nodded slightly, like he understood more than I said, and let the conversation shift naturally. That was the moment I started to notice him differently. Not because of what he was saying, but because of what he wasn't doing. He wasn't trying to impress me. Wasn't asking questions just to keep me engaged. He spoke when it mattered, and when he didn't, he allowed the moment to exist without pressure. Time passed without me realizing it. The conversation moved from small observations to something slightly deeper, but never overwhelming. He asked what I did, but not in a way that felt like he was measuring me. He listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually paying attention. And when he responded, it wasn't generic. It was specific enough to show he had been listening the entire time. That alone felt different. At some point, I realized something I hadn't felt in days. I wasn't thinking about what had happened anymore. Not because I had forgotten, but because for the first time, my mind wasn't stuck there. And that shift, as small as it seemed, mattered more than anything else in that moment. When it was time to leave, there was no dramatic ending. No forced continuation. Just a simple acknowledgement that the moment had happened. But as I walked away, I noticed something I hadn't expected. For the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't feel as heavy as I did before I walked in. The more time passed, the more I started to notice things I hadn't paid attention to in the beginning. Not obvious things, not anything he openly showed, but details that revealed themselves slowly if you were paying attention. The way people greeted him, not casually, but with a kind of quiet respect that didn't need to be explained. The way conversations shifted slightly when he was involved, like people became more precise with their words, more aware of how they presented themselves. At first, I thought it was just personality, the kind of presence some people naturally carry. But over time, it became clear it was more than that. It wasn't something he talked about. In fact, he avoided it. Whenever conversations moved too close to anything personal about him, he redirected them without making it obvious. Not dismissive, just controlled. And that made it even more noticeable. Because people who have something to prove usually lean into it. They make sure you know. But he didn't. I found out accidentally. Not from him, but from someone who spoke about him in a way that made everything connect instantly. The level he operated on, the influence he had, the kind of decisions he made daily, it wasn't something I had ever been exposed to before. And for a moment, it shifted how I saw him. Not in a negative way, but in a way that made me pause. But what stayed with me wasn't the information itself. It was how little it changed the way he behaved. He didn't suddenly become different. Didn't start acting like someone who needed to be recognized. He remained the same person I had been talking to. Calm. Intentional. Unbothered by things most people would use to define themselves. And that's when I realized something important. His value didn't come from what he had. It came from who he was without needing to prove it. Being around him didn't create an instant transformation. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, consistent, and almost unnoticeable at first. But over time, it became clear that something was changing. Not because he told me to change, not because he tried to guide me in any direct way, but because of the environment his presence created. He paid attention to things that most people overlook. Not in a controlling way, but in a way that made you aware of your own patterns. The way you responded to situations, the way you handled pressure, the way you spoke about yourself without realizing it. And instead of correcting anything, he simply observed. And somehow, that made me more aware of myself than any advice ever could. There were moments where he would say something simple, something that didn't feel significant at first, but would stay with me long after the conversation ended. Not instructions, not criticism, just perspective. And over time, those small shifts in perspective started to change how I approach things. I became more intentional with my time, more selective with my energy, more aware of what I allowed into my life. And without realizing it, I stopped seeing myself the way I did before. The version of me that accepted less, that overlooked things that didn't feel right, that tried to make situations work even when they clearly weren't aligned, started to fade. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. Growth doesn't always come from being told what to do. Sometimes, it comes from being around someone who naturally operates at a level that makes you want to rise without being asked. When I saw him again, it wasn't something I had prepared for. There was no warning, no expectation, just a moment that happened without planning. And for a brief second, everything paused. Not because of him, but because of what he represented. A version of my past that no longer felt connected to who I had become. He looked the same. Same posture. Same expression. Nothing about him had changed. But the difference wasn't in him. It was in me. Because the person standing there wasn't the same one who walked away that night. I wasn't carrying the same emotions. I wasn't holding on to the same questions. There was nothing left unresolved. When our eyes met, there was recognition, but it didn't carry weight. It didn't pull me backward or create any internal conflict. It just existed. And the way he looked at me shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to show that he noticed something had changed. People always notice when you become something they didn't expect. When you move beyond the version they thought you would stay in. But what stood out the most wasn't his reaction. It was mine. Because I didn't feel anything I thought I would feel if this moment ever happened.
No anger. No regret.
Just clarity. And that clarity made it easy to do something that once felt impossible. I walked away without looking back. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because there was nothing left to prove. 2 years later, my life didn't feel like something I was trying to fix anymore. It felt like something I had intentionally built. Every decision carried more awareness. Every step felt more aligned with who I had become, and for the first time, I wasn't questioning whether I was on the right path. I knew I was. The version of me that once felt lost, uncertain, and dependent on someone else's presence to feel complete didn't exist anymore. Not because I forced that change, but because I grew out of it naturally. Experience has a way of doing that. It reshapes how you see things without asking for permission.
And he was still part of my life.
Not as someone who defined it, not as someone I depended on, but as someone who had been there during a time when I needed perspective the most. Someone who didn't try to fix me, but allowed me to rebuild myself properly. The opportunities that came into my life after that didn't feel random. They felt earned. Like everything I had gone through had positioned me for something more aligned than what I originally thought I wanted. And that's when everything made sense. I didn't lose anything that night. I was redirected to something greater than I could have planned. If this story touched you in any way, don't just watch and scroll. Take a second to like this video and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that sometimes the people who break us are the ones who push us into something greater. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought your life was falling apart, but it actually led you to something better? Tell me your story in the comments. I read them. And who knows, your story might be the one someone else needs to hear today.